All right, back with Ryan Callahan. You cover recruiting for GoVols247.com. To give this one a little bit more weight this week, instead of me asking you specific questions, I wanted to just say, all right, what are your top three biggest recruiting stories you're covering regarding the Vols right now? So, most number one, biggest, coolest story. What do you got? What's number one?
Well, it's a very big picture thing, but I think it's worth mentioning because it's maybe even a little different from past years. Just the visitors Tennessee is hosting throughout spring practice. There is a ton of quality players coming through Knoxville throughout the past few weeks. Just this week alone, on Monday, a 5-star wide receiver for the scrimmage Thursday night. Another of their top wide receiver targets in from California. Yesterday for the practice, a handful of their top offensive line targets, including the number 2 player in the country, David Sanders from Charlotte, a few other top receiver targets. It's been a really impressive list of guys coming in throughout the past 3 weeks. So Tennessee's in a lot of battles, and I would just say, generally speaking, has as healthy of a recruiting board as I've probably seen in several years, because they've got so many guys that they're in play with that just about every position on the board, and a lot of them have made it to Tennessee already or are coming in next weekend for the spring game.
That's a good sign. We talked a couple of years ago after they went 11-2, and we're like, well, we're not seeing a big bump. Maybe it took a little time.
And it's year 4 for a staff. I think that always shows up that you've had more time. They've been
Build
recruiting this.
relationships
They've
with
been
coaches.
recruiting this class for a long time already, so that's showing up, and they're certainly getting a lot of these guys on campus now.
What's the second biggest story you're covering?
Well, it's sort of a branch off of those two. I think because they're important positions with the big-time quarterback already committed in George McIntyre. Who can he bring in around him? I think a lot of that goes to offense. There's a lot of emphasis on offensive tackle. So I think offensive tackle, who they end up with there is kind of one of the big storylines for this class. I mentioned David Sanders, Juan Gaston out of Georgia, battling Georgia, some other big programs for him. They're in a lot of heavyweight fights. Josh Petty, a guy that grew up liking Tennessee out of the Atlanta area, battling Clemson, Georgia, other teams like that for him. So they're in a lot of big-time battles, but who are they going to get? You know, J. Allen Matthews out of New Jersey is one of the guys I think they're in the best shape with right now, but they've got a pretty healthy board there. But again, out of 7 or 8 guys that they really like, who do they end up with to give Nico Iamaleava and George McIntyre some real protection there on the offensive line and continue building up some depth there where they obviously have shown this spring they don't have enough ideally at that position?
Last one. What's the third story?
Similar storyline at wide receiver. It's a big class, I think, at wide receiver because they've come up short numbers-wise the last 2 years. They're in it with a lot of guys, including a couple 5-stars who've been on campus this spring. Jamie French, Caleb Cunningham, some of the guys that visited this week. Rodarius Jackson out of Memphis, a big-time target in state. Travis Smith Jr. out of Atlanta. So a lot of guys that they're in the picture with, but how many can they close on? George McIntyre wants to have coattails, bring some good players with him, but in the NIL era, how much does it matter to get to team up with a guy like that? Is that the deciding factor? Does it help Tennessee? They had a little bit of trouble with Nico a couple years ago getting guys to follow him. I think they have a sense there's going to be a little more success this year, but who do they end up with out of that group? And can they get the 4 good receivers in this class they really need to kind of replenish the depth at that position?